In 1794, a mob of armed farmers in western Pennsylvania set fire to the home of a federal tax collector named John Neville. President George Washington, barely 5 years into the presidency of a nation that did not yet trust itself to survive, responded by mobilizing nearly 13,000 militia troops, roughly the same size as the entire Continental Army he had commanded during the Revolution just a decade earlier. Farms were raided, men were dragged from their homes in the middle of the night and marched toward Philadelphia in chains. Tax collectors across 4 counties had already been tarred and feathered, stripped naked, and coated in scalding pine tar before being rolled in chicken feathers and paraded through the streets as a warning to the next man who came asking for money. All of this, an armed standoff that nearly tore apart a brand new republic, started over a tax of 6 cents per gallon on one product: whiskey. Not gold, not land, not slaves, not tea. A clear, homemade corn liquor that frontier farmers distilled in their own backyards because it was the only practical way to turn a wagon load of rotting grain into something worth carrying to market. Today, you can walk into a gas station in eastern Tennessee and buy a mason jar of that same style of liquor for around $15. You can watch grown men drive laps around an oval track at nearly 200 miles an hour, sponsored by beer companies and insurance corporations, in a sport that traces its very bloodline back to the same backwoods stills that started a rebellion. So how did an illegal homemade corn spirit distilled in secret in the hollows of Appalachia evade an 18-year-old at gunpoint the federal government for over a century and somehow give birth to the single largest spectator sport in the United States? That was 1794. But the story of moonshine does not begin in Pennsylvania, and it does not begin with corn. It begins nearly 4,000 years earlier, in the river valleys of ancient Mesopotamia, in a world that had not yet invented the wheelbarrow, let alone the automobile. Distillation, the basic technique behind every drop of moonshine ever run through a mountain still, is astonishingly old. Archaeological evidence from sites in modern-day Iraq suggests that people were using simple stills as early as around 2000 BCE, though not to make liquor. They were making perfume. Heating liquid until it turns to vapor, then capturing and cooling that vapor until it turns back into liquid, concentrated and transformed, was a technology developed to extract fragrant oils from flowers and herbs, not to get anyone drunk. Alcohol distillation as we would recognize it took shape centuries later and thousands of miles away, refined by scholars working in the Islamic world during the 8th and 9th centuries. The very word alcohol comes from the Arabic al-kul, originally referring to a fine cosmetic powder, later applied to any substance purified through distillation. Think about that for a second. The word for the thing that built NASCAR traces its root back to eyeliner. These early alchemists were not thinking about hangovers. They were thinking about medicine, purification, and the transformation of matter. The same obsessions that drove their work in optics, chemistry, and mathematics. They did not know the word ethanol. They were isolating it anyway. The spread of distillation into Europe took several more centuries, and it arrived, fittingly, wrapped in myth and mistranslation. Monasteries across Ireland and Scotland are often credited with bringing the practice north, using it first to produce medicinal tinctures. The earliest written reference to whiskey in Ireland appears in the Annals of Clonmacnoise, an Irish chronicle, which records a chieftain's death in the year 1405 after what the text calls a surfeit of aqua vitae, a Latin phrase meaning water of life. The Gaelic translation of that same phrase, Uisce Baha, is where the modern word whiskey actually comes from. In Scotland, the earliest surviving official record appears in the Exchequer Rolls of 1494, a royal tax document, which notes an order to a friar named John Core for 8 bowls of malt, roughly enough grain to produce somewhere in the range of 500 bottles by modern measure, to make aqua vitae. This was not a hobbyist request. It was already, by the end of the 15th century, a matter significant enough for the crown to track and tax. Whiskey was not just a drink, it was revenue. And wherever there is revenue, there is eventually a government trying to claim its share. and someone else trying to keep it from them. Scotland, in particular, built an entire relationship between crown and countryside around this one product long before anyone in America had ever tasted it. Whiskey in the Scottish Highlands was not a novelty or an indulgence. It was currency, medicine, hospitality, and increasingly, a target. Landowners paid rent in barrels of it. Clan chiefs offered it as a mark of welcome to guests. Physicians prescribed it for ailments ranging from colic to melancholy, decades before anyone understood why it seemed to help. And every time the Crown in London needed more revenue, usually to fund yet another war on the European continent, whiskey was one of the first products anyone in Parliament thought to tax. This was not about a moral crusade against drinking. It was about revenue, plain and simple. The same motive that would eventually cross the Atlantic and land on the doorstep of Pennsylvania farmers roughly 3 centuries later. For roughly the next 200 years, whiskey production in Scotland and Ireland followed a familiar and increasingly uncomfortable pattern. Small farmers distilled it as a practical use for surplus grain, and the Crown taxed it more and more aggressively to fund wars and pay down debt. By the early 1700s, both Ireland and Scotland were riddled with illegal stills, hidden in caves, glens, and remote hillsides, run by farmers who had simply decided that feeding their families mattered more than an English tax collector's paperwork. This is where the word moonshine itself likely takes root, referring to work done secretly under cover of night by the light of the moon rather than the sun. It was not romantic. It was survival economics dressed up, generations later, in folklore. And it was this exact population, Scots-Irish farmers with generations of illegal distilling already baked into their culture, who would soon cross an ocean and carry the practice directly into the American frontier. Beginning in the early 1700s and accelerating through the middle of the century, tens of thousands of Scots-Irish immigrants left Ulster for the American colonies, pushed out by rising rents, religious discrimination, and a string of poor harvests. They did not settle along the wealthy coastal ports. Colonial land near the Atlantic was already claimed, expensive, and controlled by established families. So these new arrivals pushed inland and upward into the Appalachian mountain range stretching from Pennsylvania down through Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. It was rugged, isolated, and largely ignored by colonial and later federal authorities, which made it, structurally, almost identical to the Scottish Highlands and Irish hill country these families had just left behind. They brought their farming techniques, their fiddle tunes, their Presbyterian churches, and their stills. Corn, unlike the barley of Scotland, grew abundantly in the fresh Appalachian soil, and corn became the new backbone of American moonshine. Cheap, hardy, and nearly impossible to sell profitably in its raw form once you accounted for the cost of hauling it over mountain roads to a distant market. A farmer might need to load a horse with roughly 4 bushels of corn to make the trip worthwhile. Distilled into whiskey, that same amount of grain could be carried in a fraction of the space and sold for many times the price. This was not a moral choice. It was arithmetic. Turning corn into liquor was not about getting drunk. It was about turning a bulky, perishable crop into a durable, portable, and far more valuable commodity. One that could double as currency on a frontier that barely had access to hard cash at all. Even George Washington, the same man who would later send troops to crush a whiskey rebellion, understood the economics perfectly. In 1797, on the advice of his Scottish farm manager, Washington built a distillery at Mount Vernon. Within 2 years, it had grown into one of the largest whiskey operations in the entire country, producing an estimated 11,000 gallons in 1799 alone. The father of the country, in other words, ran a whiskey operation on a scale that would have made most Appalachian farmers blush, and he did it completely legally, on a plantation, with enslaved and hired labor, paying whatever taxes were required. That contrast is worth sitting with. The same activity that built Washington's private fortune on his own estate would soon become a hanging adjacent crime for the farmers who tried to do it without land, without capital, and without connections. And that profit motive, the growing federal appetite to tax whiskey specifically, is exactly where this story turns from folk economics into outright rebellion. In 1791, at the urging of Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, Congress passed the young nation's first major domestic tax, an excise on distilled spirits, designed to help pay down the enormous debts the federal government had assumed from the states after the Revolutionary War. It was, on paper, a reasonable idea. In practice, it landed almost entirely on the backs of small Western farmers, the exact population for whom whiskey was not a luxury product, but a functional substitute for cash. Larger commercial distillers back east paid a flat annual rate and actually received a discount the more they produced. Small backcountry farmers, who might only run a still a few weeks a year, were taxed by the gallon regardless of scale, a structure that functioned almost like a tax specifically punishing the poor for being poor. Farmers in western Pennsylvania viewed it as an echo of the exact kind of taxation without meaningful representation that had triggered the revolution in the first place, and they said so, loudly. Tax collectors were threatened, ambushed, and humiliated. By the summer of 1794, the resistance had become an armed uprising. Nearly 400 rebels surrounded the home of regional tax inspector John Neville, exchanged gunfire, and eventually burned the property to the ground. Washington, faced with what looked like the first real test of federal authority under the new Constitution, made the decision to respond with overwhelming force. Here is the detail that makes this strange. He personally rode out with the militia for part of the journey, the only sitting United States president in history to ever personally command troops in the field. The rebellion collapsed almost immediately once it became clear the federal government was serious. Only 2 men were ever convicted of treason, and both were later pardoned by Washington himself. But the deeper lesson, the one that would echo through Appalachian culture for the next 150 years, was not really about whiskey at all. It was about trust. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. An entire regional identity was born in that standoff, one built on a deep generational suspicion of federal tax collectors, an identity that would resurface with even greater force under an entirely different federal law more than a century later. Whiskey production did not disappear after the Whiskey Rebellion. It simply went quiet. Farmers across Appalachia kept running small stills tucked into hollows and creek beds, largely under the radar of a federal government that lacked the manpower and, frankly, the political appetite to chase down every farmer with a copper pot in the woods. For roughly the next century, illegal distilling in the mountains existed in an uneasy equilibrium with federal tax law, periodically disrupted by revenue agents known locally as revenuers, but never eliminated. That equilibrium was about to be shattered completely, not by a new tax, but by an entirely new kind of law. One that did not just tax whiskey, it banned it outright, for everyone, everywhere in the country. And that ban is where this story stops being a quiet regional tradition and becomes one of the strangest, darkest chapters in American economic history. On January 16, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution took effect, banning the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors nationwide. It was the culmination of decades of organizing by the temperance movement, driven by genuine and often well-founded concerns about alcohol's role in domestic violence, poverty, and workplace accidents. The intention was to build a healthier, more sober nation. Here is the uncomfortable reality that followed almost immediately. Prohibition did not eliminate demand for alcohol. It simply erased the legal supply of it, and demand rushed into the vacuum with terrifying speed. For a region like Appalachia, where illegal distilling was already a deeply embedded multi-generational skill set, prohibition was not a crisis. It was, in the coldest possible economic terms, an opportunity of a lifetime. Farmers who had been running small stills for local consumption suddenly found themselves sitting on a product that an entire nation, thirsty and cash-rich from the industrial boom of the 1920s, desperately wanted. Moonshine did not just survive Prohibition. Moonshine was not just legal before Prohibition and illegal after it. Prohibition transformed moonshine from a regional folk tradition into a full-scale national industry, feeding underground markets in cities as far away as Chicago and New York, often funneled through organized crime networks that had the capital and distribution muscle the mountain producers lacked on their own. This is where the story requires full honesty rather than romance, because Prohibition's death toll rarely makes it into the nostalgic version of this history. As demand for alcohol surged, the federal government made a decision that today reads as almost unbelievable. Industrial alcohol, used legitimately in paints, solvents, and fuel, was already required to be denatured, meaning laced with additives to make it unfit for drinking and therefore exempt from the liquor ban. Bootleggers quickly learned how to chemically strip many of those additives back out, redistilling stolen or diverted industrial alcohol into something drinkable. In response, the Treasury Department, under President Calvin Coolidge, ordered the denaturing formula made significantly more toxic, adding methyl alcohol, commonly known as wood alcohol, in concentrations that were far more difficult to remove and, crucially, far more lethal to the human body. The New York City chief medical examiner at the time, Charles Norris, was blunt about what this meant. He stated publicly that the government knew this poisoning was not stopping people from drinking and knew what was happening to those who drank it anyway and continued the policy regardless. By the time Prohibition ended, an estimated 10,000 Americans had died from drinking poisoned industrial alcohol, deliberately poisoned by their own government as a deterrent. 10,000 people. In a single stretch during the Christmas season of 1926, dozens died in New York City alone within a matter of days. This was not a side effect of bootlegging gone wrong. This was policy. And it fell heaviest, as these things always do, on the poorest drinkers, the ones with no access to genuinely safe professionally distilled liquor, which is exactly the population that Mountain Moonshine, for all its own risks around lead-soldered stills and inconsistent quality, was often trying to serve. And it was not only poison that made this trade dangerous. Federal and state revenue agents, still carrying the old nickname of revenuers passed down from generations of Appalachian suspicion, pursued moonshiners with raids, informants, and occasional gunfights that left both agents and distillers dead in the woods. Stills were smashed with axes on site, whenever agents could actually locate them, which was not often given how effectively the terrain itself protected the operations. The Great Smoky Mountains alone offered thousands of square miles of dense forest, steep ridgelines, and hidden creek beds, terrain that made large-scale enforcement nearly impossible for a chronically underfunded federal prohibition bureau. Congress had passed a sweeping national ban without ever appropriating anywhere near the money needed to actually enforce it, a mismatch between ambition and funding that meant, in practice, the mountains of Appalachia had already been making illegal alcohol for over 100 years by the time nationwide prohibition even began. And the federal government's sudden expanded interest changed the stakes far more than it changed the underlying behavior. Down in Appalachia, away from the industrial poisoning scandals playing out in northern cities, the moonshine economy exploded on its own terms. Hundreds of families across the mountains of Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, and Georgia ran stills around the clock, boiling corn mash in the woods, running the vapor through cooling coils, and collecting the finished product in glass jars and tin cans to be hauled out under cover of darkness. This was not, for most families, an act of rebellion or bravado. Legal industries in many of these counties had already collapsed or never existed in the first place, and when the Great Depression hit in 1929, moonshining became, for entire communities, not one option among several, but the only reliable way to earn cash at all. A farmer could not eat corn liquor, but he could trade it, sell it, and use it to buy the things a subsistence farm could not produce. This was not a battle. It was survival. And it was survival that required speed, silence, and increasingly, a very particular kind of driving. Getting moonshine out of the mountains and into thirsty cities meant hauling it, often at night, over narrow, winding, poorly maintained mountain roads, with federal and state revenue agents actively hunting for exactly this kind of cargo. A slow car meant a caught driver, a seized car, a jail sentence, and a ruined family income. So bootleggers and the mechanics who worked alongside them began quietly transforming ordinary factory cars into something else entirely. They strengthened suspensions to handle the extra weight of 100 gallons or more of liquor hidden under false floorboards and behind rear seats. They bored out engine cylinders, swapped in more powerful carburetors, and tuned Ford flathead V8 engines until unassuming family sedans could reportedly top 100 miles an hour on straight stretches, an almost unbelievable speed for the roads and technology of the late 1930s. On the outside, these cars looked completely ordinary, deliberately so. That was the entire point. A whiskey car was supposed to look exactly like every other car on the road, right up until the moment a revenue agent tried to pull it over, at which point it would simply disappear into the dark at a speed no patrol car of the era could match. Here is the part that does not get enough credit. These drivers were not professional racers with training and sponsorships. They were farm boys and mechanics who had taught themselves through sheer necessity and repetition how to control a car at terrifying speeds on hairpin mountain curves, with a life-altering prison sentence riding on every mistake. That skill did not disappear once the liquor was delivered. It needed somewhere else to go. If you are finding this interesting so far, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because this channel covers stories exactly like this every single week, tracing the strange hidden histories behind everyday things, and you will not want to miss what is coming in the back half of this one, because this is where an illegal liquor trade turns into one of the biggest businesses in American sports. Informal races between bootleggers had actually been happening for years before anyone thought to organize them, often starting as simple bragging rights contests. Drivers would gather in cow pastures, empty fields, and stretches of dirt road to settle once and for all whose whiskey car was truly the fastest. Word spread. Locals started showing up to watch. Then more locals showed up. Then somebody realized that a crowd willing to gather and watch two liquor cars race around a dirt oval was also, whether the moonshiners liked it or not, a paying audience. Among the earliest stars of this unofficial scene were a trio of cousins from Georgia: Raymond Parks, Lloyd C., and Roy Hall. C. and Hall ran moonshine as teenagers through the Georgia hills, and Parks, himself a former bootlegger who had served jail time for it, used his service station as a base to sponsor their increasingly competitive race cars. C. in particular developed a reputation as one of the finest natural drivers anyone in the region had ever seen, winning early stock car championships in 1939, 1941, and 1945. Whether every detail of the old stories about his driving is remembered with perfect accuracy after so many decades of retelling remains difficult to verify, but the trophies and the newspaper coverage from the era are real, and so was the tragedy that came with it. C was shot and killed in a dispute over sugar, an essential ingredient for making moonshine, in 1941 at the age of 21, just hours after winning a major race. He never lived to see what his sport would become. One man watching all of this unfold closely was a mechanic and part-time racer from Washington, D.C., named William Henry Getty France, known to nearly everyone as Big Bill. France had moved to Daytona Beach, Florida in 1935, drawn by the area's flat, hard-packed sand, which had already become an informal proving ground for speed enthusiasts. He raced in an early promotional stock car event on the Daytona Beach and Road Course in 1936, an event that actually lost money for its organizers, and came away convinced that stock car racing, chaotic, regional, and completely unregulated as it was, had real commercial potential if someone would just impose some order on it. It took him more than a decade to make that vision real. On December 14, 1947, France invited roughly 35 drivers, mechanics, and promoters, many of them with personal and unspoken ties to the moonshine trade, to a series of meetings at the Streamline Hotel in Daytona Beach. Over 3 days, they hashed out a shared rulebook, a shared point system, and a shared vision for turning scattered regional races into one unified professional sport. On February 21, 1948, the National Association for Stock Car Auto Racing, NASCAR, was officially incorporated. The very first NASCAR-sanctioned race had actually already taken place 6 days earlier, on February 15, 1948, on the Daytona Beach and Road Course, and it was won by a driver named Red Byron, himself a former Moonshine runner driving a modified Ford. Think about that for a second. The first ever winner in the history of what would become the most popular motorsport in the United States earned his driving skills evading federal liquor agents. For years afterward, the line between the whiskey trade and the racetrack stayed remarkably thin. Many of the best drivers in NASCAR's earliest seasons were still actively running Moonshine on the side, because, in a detail that tends to catch modern fans off guard, the actual pay for winning an early NASCAR race often did not match what a skilled driver could earn hauling liquor in a single good night. Drivers occasionally missed scheduled races entirely because they were serving jail sentences for bootlegging charges, a scheduling conflict essentially unimaginable in any other professional sport in American history. No other major league in the country has ever had to work around its own athletes' prison terms for a side business in illegal liquor. The single most famous case is Robert Glenn Johnson Jr., known to everyone as Junior Johnson, a second-generation moonshiner from Wilkes County, North Carolina, who began running his family's corn whiskey in modified 1940 Ford coupes as a teenager, hauling loads reportedly exceeding 120 gallons at a time along treacherous mountain roads. Junior Johnson was eventually convicted for his role in his father's moonshining operation and served time in federal prison. Yet he went on to become one of NASCAR's first true superstars, winning 50 races across the 1950s and 1960s, and later building one of the most successful team ownership operations in the sport's history. Decades afterward, in 1986, President Ronald Reagan granted Johnson a full and unconditional presidential pardon. Johnson's own summary of the connection between his two careers has been widely quoted over the years, boiled down to a single, blunt sentence: that if it had not been for whiskey, NASCAR would never have been formed. Whether that is a slight overstatement of a much more complicated founding story involving beach racing, promotional showmanship, and post-war American car culture, historians still debate the exact weighting of causes. But the fact that the sport's own most legendary driver tells the story that way tells you something important all on its own. Bill France Sr., meanwhile, spent much of the 1950s and 60s trying to do exactly the opposite of what his sport's own origin story suggested, actively working to distance NASCAR's public image from its outlaw liquor roots. He wanted family-friendly races for what he called plain, ordinary working people, sponsors who would put their name on a car without worrying about a driver's other legal troubles, and a sport that television networks and major corporations could eventually embrace without hesitation. That effort worked, eventually, spectacularly well. NASCAR grew from regional dirt track curiosity into a genuine national institution, complete with the construction of the massive high-bank Daytona International Speedway in 1959, the sport's marquee event, the Daytona 500, and by 1979, the first flag-to-flag live network broadcast of a major NASCAR race, a broadcast that happened to end in a dramatic post-race fistfight between competitors and helped cement the sport's growing national television audience almost by accident. The France family has continued to control NASCAR's leadership in the decades since, passing control from Bill France Sr. to his son Bill France Jr. in the mid-1970s, and onward through subsequent generations, an unbroken line of family leadership, stretching back to a group of 35 men meeting in a beachside hotel, with more moonshine connections than any of them were willing to discuss on the record. That brings us to today. And this is the part that tends to genuinely surprise people who assume moonshine simply faded into folklore after Prohibition ended in 1933. It did not fade at all. It went legal, and it went big. Federal prohibition ended with the ratification of the 21st Amendment, but many individual counties and states, particularly across the South, kept their own local alcohol restrictions in place for decades afterward, some of them lingering all the way into the 21st century, which meant that illegal moonshining as a genuine underground trade continued in pockets of Appalachia far longer than most Americans realize. Meanwhile, starting in the 2000s and accelerating sharply over the past 15 years, a wave of legal craft distilleries began obtaining licenses to produce and sell moonshine completely above board, marketing the exact outlaw heritage that federal agents had spent a century trying to stamp out. Brands built directly on this mythology, such as Ole Smoky Distillery, Sugarlands Distilling Company, and Junior Johnson's own legal Midnight Moon label, launched in partnership with the very driver who once served federal prison time for the same activity, have turned corn liquor into a legitimate, heavily marketed consumer product, sold in flavors ranging from apple pie to peach. According to industry analysis published in 2026, the global moonshine market was valued at roughly $15.9 billion and is projected to grow to nearly $30 billion by 2036. A product that could get a farmer imprisoned, or in the darkest years of Prohibition enforcement, poisoned by his own government, is now a multi-billion-dollar line item in corporate spirits portfolios, sold in flavored varieties to 21-year-olds looking for something a little different than vodka. And NASCAR, the sport those same outlaw liquor runners essentially invented on cow pastures and beach sand, has become one of the most commercially significant sports leagues in the entire country, drawing enormous television audiences, corporate sponsorship deals worth many hundreds of millions of dollars combined across the sport, and a devoted fan base that, in a detail that would likely have amused Junior Johnson himself, now watches races at tracks built on land that, in more than one case across the South, sits within a reasonably short drive of the exact hollows and mountain roads where the whole thing started. Here is a detail that catches most people off guard, even after hearing the rest of this story. Some of the last old-school illegal moonshiners were not distant historical figures at all. Marvin Sutton, better known by his nickname Popcorn, ran stills in the mountains of North Carolina and Tennessee well into the 2000s, decades after most Americans assumed the practice had quietly died out. He became something of a folk celebrity, appearing in documentaries and interviews, openly discussing a trade that was, at the time he was filmed doing it, still completely illegal under federal law. Federal agents eventually caught up with him in 2009, and facing the prospect of prison time in his 60s, Sutton took his own life rather than serve the sentence. His story is a sober reminder that even as moonshine transformed into a flavored, brightly labeled product on liquor store shelves, the older, unlicensed version of the trade never fully disappeared, and it never stopped carrying real legal risk for the people who kept practicing it the old way, off the books, in the same hills their great-grandparents had used. It was there in the river valleys of ancient Mesopotamia, disguised as a perfume maker's experiment. It was there in medieval Ireland and Scotland, taxed by kings and hidden from tax collectors in equal measure. It was there when Scots-Irish farmers carried it across an ocean and up into the American mountains because the arithmetic of corn and distance simply demanded it. It was there when it sparked the first serious armed challenge to federal authority in the history of the United States Constitution. It was there when a desperate federal government, trying to save Americans from themselves, ended up poisoning roughly 10,000 of them instead. It was there in the trunks and rebuilt suspensions of souped-up Ford coupes tearing down mountain roads at night, one step ahead of the law. And it was there, quietly, at the center of the very first race that would eventually grow into NASCAR, in the hands of drivers who had learned everything they knew about speed and nerve while running from federal agents rather than chasing a trophy. Moonshine was never just a drink. It was a tax rebellion, a survival strategy, a government scandal, and, almost by accident, the origin story of stock car racing. Not bad, honestly, for a jar of homemade corn liquor that most of the country still associates with a cartoon hillbilly stereotype rather than any of the history that actually built it. If any part of this surprised you, the Whiskey Rebellion, the government's own poisoning program during Prohibition, or the fact that NASCAR's first champion was a literal bootlegger, let me know in the comments which detail caught you most off guard. And if you enjoy stories like this, ones that dig underneath the everyday and find something far stranger sitting there, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because there is a lot more of this coming, and I will see you in the next one.